Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Friedrich Merz is set to become the next Chancellor of Germany as exit polls suggest his centre-right grouping has won the election, while the far-right AfD make historic gains.
I'm Sumi Somaskanda, live in Berlin, where the question now turns to building a coalition government. Friedrich Merz says he will not work with the far-right. The question now moves forward to who will he work with.
Volodymyr Zelensky says he's willing to give up his presidency if it will mean peace for Ukraine. And the Vatican says Pope Francis remains in a critical condition in hospital, but hasn't had any respiratory attacks since Saturday morning. Hello, I'm Ritika Gupta and welcome to the programme. And we begin in Germany, where Conservative parties appear to have secured a decisive victory in snap elections. According to the exit polls, Friedrich Merz of the centre-right Christian Democrats is poised to become Germany's next chancellor after the party secured 30% of the vote. But the far-right Alternative for Germany party, better known as AfD, came in second with a record 20%. Boosting the EU's biggest economy and immigration reforms were the top issues for voters following the collapse of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition last fall. The three outgoing parties, including Scholz's ruling Social Democrats, were considered the biggest losers of Sunday's election, pointing to German voters' frustration with the incumbent government. But Merz now faces the challenge of forming a coalition government and has already discounted bringing in the AfD. So for more, now I'm joined by Sumi Somaskanda from Berlin. So talk to me about the reaction from the ground from Germany's party's leaders. We heard earlier from Friedrich Merz addressing the public.
Yeah, Ritika, it's been an interesting evening. We've heard from all the party leaders. Traditionally here in Germany on an election night, about an hour and a half after you get the exit poll results, you see all of the chancellor candidates from all of the parties sit together at a big round table on German television where they talk about the results and the possibility of how things go forward from here. Very interesting to note that Alice Weidel, the leader of the far-right AfD, said she feels like there is a democratic deficit in Germany's system because her party was able to achieve their best result ever, close to 20% of the vote. Important to say that is the first time in Germany's post-war history that a far-right party has been that successful, and yet they will not be part of any government because, as you said, the other centrist parties have all said they will not form a coalition with the far right. That is historically, since the end of the war, something that the centrist parties have agreed on together. Now, if you look at Olaf Scholz, you just mentioned in your lead-in, Ritika, he actually said, this is a big disappointment for his party. Still, they are looking likely to go into coalition negotiations in the coming weeks. As for Friedrich Merz, of course, he was victorious tonight, saying his party had the biggest share of the vote, which is true, a little bit less than they had been hoping for. But regardless, certainly now he has the mandate to build a government. But very interesting this evening in that political round, he talked about foreign policy, and he said that what he is seeing in the U.S. he has no illusions about, and that the interference of the U.S., speaking about J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, supporting the AfD, for example, or Elon Musk hosting an event with the AfD, that was as brazen as the type of interference that has come from Moscow. So very strong words on the relationship with the U.S. Interesting to hear that now from who is likely to be the next chancellor.
You've been speaking to voters out there. What has been the mood? I mean, this was hardly a big surprise, was it?
It wasn't. I mean, a lot of anxiety and nervousness from voters we spoke to. You have to look at the fact that the turnout was actually around 83%, which is a significant rise on the last election. So voters were really motivated to go to the polls in this election. And the voters we talked to said very clearly the issues that dominated for them were migration, so curbing illegal migration into Germany. This has been especially a topic here since we saw a string of attacks in a number of German cities that have really shaken the country. And the economy, you really see so many people here, so many voters talking about the high energy costs since Russia launched its war on Ukraine and Germany turned off Russian oil and gas, and the fact that inflation has really hit the economy hard as well. But we spoke to some people also about why they voted for the parties they did. Take a listen.
Who am I voting for? AfD. The party represents my interests. The party is there for the people.
I vote for the SPD, and my hope is that we get the immigration. That is a big problem for Germany, which people come in and which people have to go out. Yeah.
I hope they change good things for family and for kids. I hope they support families, for example, with money and something. I hope we have a strong Europe. I would like to have a strong European Union.
I hope that many people realize that going to the right is not the right answer, and that many people switch their votes far more left, because I fear that the election is going to be a total blowout for the CDU or the AfD. And I just hope that the direction this country changes overall, that we all vote more left and learn to love people more, and hope to be more active for the other people in our communities.
Okay, so a range of voices there. And a really interesting factor in this election is you've seen the youth vote, so voters under 25. You've seen those voters go for either the far left or the far right. So young voters moving to the fringes of the political spectrum here in Germany and away from the established elite parties in the center. That is a really significant trend. And certainly, as we see Friedrich Merz and the Christian Democrats try to form a coalition government, something they'll have to address, of course, not only migration, the economy, the war in Ukraine, and relations with the U.S., but also bringing more young people on board as they look ahead to the next elections.
All right, thank you so much there to Sumi Somaskanda in Berlin. Now, for more, I'm pleased to say joining me is Deutsche Welle's US correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber. So welcome, Ben. It looks like Friedrich Merz is all but set to become now the Chancellor of Germany, but the big question is who he might govern with.
That's right, and he said he would prefer if it's just one coalition partner, but as he will need at least 316 out of the 630 seats in the Bundestag, there might be two. There is this 5% threshold, meaning that if a party is not reaching 5%, they will not be able to get into the Bundestag. That will be very important in this case for the FDP, for the Liberals, that were part of this three-party coalition that led to the snap election. Because if they make 4.9%, they will not be part of the Bundestag this time. There was already this discussion that also your colleague Sumi Somaskanda mentioned in Berlin with all of the party leaders, because now the negotiations will start, and Friedrich Merz, who is set to become the next Chancellor of Germany, says that he hopes that this will conclude as soon as possible for Germany to take a leading role also when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, so to have this conversation as quickly as possible.
So just building on that, what happens if there is no coalition deal?
So they will try, he has the mandate, of course, he will talk to all of the different parties, not talking to the far-right AfD. Alice Weidel, she was also there present, is saying that she is stretching out the hand, so offering them something, but he said that he will not go into a coalition with the far-right, as all the other parties have stated. That's called the firewall, something that Vice President J.D. Vance criticized in his speech at the Munich Security Conference, saying that it's not time for the firewalls. But there will now be the time to talk to all of the different parties, to see what the Greens said, to see what the Social Democrats say, and then try to form this government.
And talk to me more about the far-right AfD party, because they're now going to be the main challenger, the main opposition. What is the significance of that? I mean, we know that Elon Musk has certainly been their cheerleader over here in the States.
And a very strong cheerleader. He's been posting a lot of tweets in the last couple of days. He had this longer talk with Alice Weidel. Only, I think, 1 or 2 days ago, he posted a quote of Björn Höcke, one of the more radical people within that party who can legally be called a fascist, according to a German court order, who was fined for using Nazi slogans. He posted that, and I covered the far-right AfD before moving to the US, and it shows, and also I think one of the results now is how strong the work is with young people doing their work, as Sumi also mentioned, with the AfD and with the left party, how strong they are on TikTok. The AfD is really strong on TikTok, really strong in the eastern states of Germany, where also not only the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, that's another new party that kind of was part of the Linke, of the left party, and also moved to another place, but that the AfD is really strong there. Of course, main topics, economy, irregular migration, saying that a lot needs to be done there. And many are criticizing Friedrich Merz of copying the program of the AfD. And that's also what Alice Weidel said, saying, you copied our program and you will not be able to actually pass this program if you have a coalition with the Green Party or with the Social Democrats.
Okay, and I thought it was interesting, the point that you're making, that the AfD is certainly gaining a lot of traction with younger voters. And then you mentioned immigration and the economy as two key issues that voters really cared about in this election. So how do you think the CDU now plans to address those with policy?
The big question is if the CDU will manage to, without moving too far their program to the right, trying to get more of the voters. Because Alice Weidel said, if Friedrich Merz does not want to talk to me, maybe other people in the party will. So she opened the possibility for other people within the CDU to try to get into conversations with the AfD. So they managed to put this key topic on the agenda, also always a lot of politicizing some of the attacks that recently happened. We had one in Munich. Then also the Christmas attack, Breitscheidplatz in Berlin. So using that, saying that Germany needs to secure the borders and also that they need to do more. But the question is, how will you on one side manage to do this? Because there's also statistics saying that a higher migration in Germany has not led to a higher crime rate. But they are using this as one of the main key points, and they will definitely continue pressing for tighter reforms from the side of the opposition, as they will not be part of the German government.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights. That was Benjamin Alvarez Gruber there. Now, European leaders are rallying behind Ukraine as it approaches 3 years of war. Among a flurry of calls to allies on Sunday, British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron about meeting Ukraine's security needs. Both leaders are heading to Washington this week for separate talks with President Trump. And on Monday, the UK and EU are expected to announce a fresh round of sanctions against Russia for its aggression in Ukraine. Here's a look at where territorial gains currently stand. The regions in red in Ukraine's east are controlled by Russia, while the purple shows areas that have been regained or held by Ukrainian forces. Overnight, Russia launched its largest drone attack yet, targeting at least 13 regions overnight, including the capital, Kyiv. From there, the BBC's Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse sent this report.
In Kyiv, war fatigue has a different meaning than it does in Washington. A record 267 Russian drones were launched in one night. Most were shot down, but some always break Ukraine's stretched air defences, like here in Zaporizhia. This attack preceded a wartime fixture in the capital, President Zelensky's anniversary press conference. This year there was an elephant in the room, with Donald Trump siding with Moscow in claiming that he lacks legitimacy without an election. Ukraine's leader gave a surprising response.
If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I am ready. I can trade it for NATO, if there are such conditions. I'm focused on Ukraine's security today, not in 20 years. I'm not going to be in power for decades.
The White House is demanding access to billions of dollars worth of Ukraine's natural minerals in exchange for the military aid it's provided to date and could in the future. Mr. Zelensky says America's help so far have been agreed as grants, not loans.
When the US sells weapons to Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, do they earn 100% interest? I just want a dialogue with President Trump. I'm not signing something that will be paid off by 10 generations of Ukrainians.
That was the most relaxed we've seen President Zelensky in this anniversary press conference. Clearly, he and Donald Trump have a relationship that is far from ideal. And you get the sense, outwardly at least, that he would not accept a mineral deal or ceasefire plan that he didn't think was in the interests of Ukraine. And that would have profound consequences for the course of this war. In Russia, the invasion's architect, Vladimir Putin, was honouring fallen soldiers on Defenders Day. Medals were also given to troops fighting in Ukraine. His new relationship with Washington has been described as promising by the Kremlin. At the moment, any peace deal looks set to favour him and not Kyiv. To mark the 3-year anniversary of an invasion Russia hoped would last 3 days, there have been demonstrations across Europe, from Prague to Paris. But leaders here are now working out how to provide security in a post-war Europe without America.
And at a crucial time in the war, the United States is retracting support for Ukraine and showing apparent favour to longtime adversary Russia. U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, Steve Witkoff, on Sunday defended President Trump's approach to resolving the conflict.
I think that President Trump believes, and I believe because he believes it, that trust building begins with good, proper communication. And we just had a great discussion, me and President Putin, and now it will be up to President Putin and President Trump to work something out, and I think they're going to be successful.
And joining me live now is Stephen Pifer, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine under President Clinton. So let us start off there. I mean, what do you feel of the U.S.'s approach to Ukraine? We've certainly heard President Donald Trump criticize Zelensky, calling him a dictator and other such names.
Well, I very much fear that the Trump administration has made some crucial mistakes the last 2 weeks. First of all, President Trump and his Secretary of Defense talked about in a negotiation, Ukraine could not get back all of its territory and could not expect to join NATO. So already at the outset, they're making a big lean towards Russian positions. That doesn't seem to me the way to broker the kind of settlement that's going to be needed. And then you had this rush by the president to engage President Putin that was somewhat unseemly. He didn't first have a conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky to understand whether Ukrainians might or might not have flexibility. He didn't talk about the Europeans, about what they could contribute. And he also did nothing to build any leverage with Putin before having that conversation. So I fear the president has put himself in a hole.
So speaking of leverage and the negotiating table, we've seen now Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that he would give up his presidency in exchange for Ukraine NATO membership. Is that going to be enough to appease the Russians, and will it change the course of the negotiations?
Well, the Russians have made very clear that they do not want to see Ukraine in NATO. But again, this was why it was unwise for President Trump and Secretary Hegseth 10 days ago to rule that out. A settlement is going to be judged primarily on 2 issues: how much Ukrainian territory remains under Russian control, and what kind of security guarantees does Ukraine receive. That's got to take place as the result of a negotiation, and it's really got to be between Russians and Ukrainians. If there's going to be an American attempt to negotiate a settlement with Moscow and then present it to Ukraine, the Ukrainians will say no.
And Russia and U.S. teams are reportedly planning another meeting this week. I mean, what do you expect to come from that?
Well, again, they've talked about meetings. Actually, I think some of the meetings they're talking about now seem to be focused more on bilateral U.S.-Russia issues. But again, before going too far with Russia on settling this war, the Trump administration has to find a way to get Russians and Ukrainians in the room together.
And the UK announced that they're going to have some new sanctions in place against Russia on Mondays, and these are said to be maybe the largest since the early days of the war, and the EU also set to join them. This contrasts to the US, which could perhaps lift sanctions. So what do you make of this divide between the US and Europe and their approach on this war?
Well, again, I think this is one of the mistakes that the Trump administration is making, is for 3 years, you've had a united Western front in support of Ukraine and in terms of sanctioning Russia. And already now, before there's been any hint of what a settlement would look like, you have people in the Trump administration talking about lifting sanctions. In fact, what they should be doing is what the UK is doing. Trump should be applying more sanctions on Russia now as a way to raise his leverage, because he's going to need leverage if he wants to bring Vladimir Putin to get off of his maximalist demands and come towards something that might look like an acceptable compromise for the Ukrainians.
And can Europe be sure that they will have American support should they need it? Is this a new world where they perhaps can't take US support for granted?
I'm a believer in the transatlantic alliance. I really wish I could say yes, but I'm afraid my answer now has to be, I'm not sure. That's not good for Europe, but I also think that ultimately that is not good for American national security interests.
And Russia just launched a large-scale drone attack across Ukraine, reportedly. And do you think they really want peace? And even if they do get a peace deal, is there faith that this will last?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why Zelensky wants to have firm security guarantees. He doesn't want to have a situation where he settles the war in 3 months, and then 3 months or 3 years down the road, there's another Russian invasion. And I believe that if Ukraine is left on its own, that's going to be a very tempting prospect for Moscow to relaunch the invasion after they regenerate forces. And I think there also is a question, do the Russians at this time really want a settlement? If you look at what Vladimir Putin has said in terms of his demands for a settlement, it's basically Ukraine's capitulation. And he has said nothing in the last 3 years to suggest he's moderated those demands. In fact, those demands have even stiffened, even when Russian forces were losing on the battlefield.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Stephen Piper, the former US ambassador to Ukraine.
Thank you.
And the already fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas appears to be in jeopardy. Just hours ago, Hamas said it will not continue negotiations with Israel unless hundreds of Palestinian prisoners are released as initially agreed between both parties in the long-awaited peace deal. In a move supported by the White House, Israel said it was delaying the prisoner release until the next release of Israeli hostages was secured. Israel now says its army will step up operational readiness around Gaza in possible preparation to resume fighting against Hamas. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks have been deployed in the occupied West Bank for the first time in 2 decades. Residents in 3 refugee camps have been expelled from the area, with the Defense Minister Israel Katz saying the Israeli army will occupy the territory for a year. And the Vatican says Pope Francis remains in a critical condition but hasn't had any further respiratory attacks. These are some live pictures now from the Gemelli Hospital in Rome, where the Pope has been for over a week. Sarah Rainsford sent this report from Rome.
Beneath the Pope's hospital window, they're keeping vigil. His condition is critical. He's asked the Vatican to be open about that and asked Catholics to pray for him.
Spero che ce la faccia.
I hope he makes it, Teresa tells me.
Facciamo penitenza per la pace.
Pope Francis had been struggling with bronchitis for some time. At this weekly audience, he was so short of breath, he said he'd ask a priest to read his address for him.
Spero che la prossima volta possa.
But the 88-year-old went on working, receiving guests even on the day he was hospitalized. Today, he should have been saying Mass here at St. Peter's. But for the crowd outside, there was no sight of him. His traditional appearance with the Angelus prayer was also cancelled for a second week. The Mass was one of the big events in a Jubilee year for the Church, very important to the Pope.
Papa Francesco.
The Archbishop said those gathered felt his presence.
Lo sentiamo vicino a noi.
But all in the Church know this is serious. Today, the Vatican said the Pope has developed a kidney problem too. Nicola and her family are Catholics from Manchester, following the updates closely.
It's really sad to see that he's gotten worse and he's in a worsening critical condition. Up until recently, it looked like it was just a small illness and he was going to be okay, but now it is quite concerning.
We're very, very sorry. We're here, worried for him. We'll say a lovely prayer.
In a city full of pilgrims, many are doing the same. The Pope's sudden downturn yesterday really shook people here, and they know he's not out of danger. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Rome.
And let's take a look at some other headlines. A British couple in their 70s have been arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds have been running training projects in Afghanistan for 18 years. Their daughter told the BBC she had not heard from them in more than 2 weeks. The UK government's assistance is limited by the fact that it does not recognise the Taliban and has no embassy in Kabul. The Italian Air Force escorted an American Airlines plane after what the airline called a security concern. Flight 292 from New York to New Delhi then made an emergency land in Rome. The airline later said the threat proved non-credible. Italian police inspected the plane and cleared it to re-depart, but passengers and crew stayed overnight in Rome so crew could rest. And before we go, let's take a look at the red carpet in Los Angeles, where stars are gathering for the Screen Actors Guild or SAG Awards. Tonight's awards are a week ahead of the wide-open Oscars race, although voting for the Oscars has closed. Lead contenders include Adrian Brody for The Brutalist and Demi Moore for The Substance. Ariana Grande and her Wicked co-star Cynthia Erivo are both set to present prizes at the ceremony this evening. And you can stay up to date with the latest stories on our website. We'll be back at the top of the hour. Stay with us here on BBC News.